How's it going, everybody? My name is Antonio, and you're about to watch or listen to the fifth episode of the 2023 Outlook series. This one, I'm joined by Jeff Snider from Eurodollar University, but who I'm not joined by is your financial advisor. This is going to be just a conversation that's general and impersonal in nature, and one that will not include any financial nor professional advice of any sorts, but it will include a lot of forward-looking statements that you shouldn't blindly trust. Matter of fact, you should always double, triple check what somebody on the internet says, because we're not here to make you money. We're here to have a conversation. And that all said, Jeff, thank you for investing your time in me, sir.
Pleasure to be back with you, Antonio.
Pleasure is all mine, of course. It made me think a lot about the things last time. People joke in the comments, look at this host getting his mind blown by Jeff, and it was true. So fair point. And I was actually, speaking of last time, since you and I spoke a few months ago, you think that I would have a better grasp on the economy by now, but I don't feel like I do. It seems like nobody can agree with each other. The data might be skewed. There are Chinese balloons. There's political turmoil, and I just don't know what's really happening. So let's start off with I guess maybe a silly question or whatever. But what's really happening in the economy? What are you paying the most attention to?
Well, I agree with you. First of all, that you think this would be really easy. If the economy is heading toward recession, there should be all sorts of very clear, straightforward signs that say this sucker's going down, whether it's Europe, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, the whole thing together. But that's not how it works, right? What ends up happening is all the data looks pretty good during expansion, and then all the data looks really bad during recession, but you go through this transitionary period where some of the data starts to look concerning, but other things make it look like everything's fine. And it's almost like you get into this tug of war that's, first of all, it's not something that happens immediately, this transition from expansion to a contraction. It can be a multi-month or even multi-year process. It really strings out over time. And during that transition phase, we're just surrounded by ambiguity, a huge gray area in terms of macroeconomic data, where you can pick and choose depending on whatever you like. You can look at, in the United States, you can look at some of the recent sentiment surveys that look like it's 2020 or it's 2008 all over again. But then we just got the payroll report last Friday that was plus 517, which suggests that the labor market continues to be really strong. In Europe, you've got a lot of data, including labor market data, low unemployment rates, but yet German retail trade, just fell off a cliff, as did German exports and imports. So I think that's consistent with the process of whichever national and international economy, parts of the international economy that are transiting from expansion, which was 2021, maybe the early part of 2022, now into this phase of later 2022, 2023, heading toward what I still believe is a pretty nasty contraction. So you have this ambiguous market data. How do you ground your analysis? That's where I really look at market curves to try to filter the macroeconomic data through some sort of fundamental sense of what everybody else is thinking. So if we see this ambiguity where some data looks good, some data looks bad, and there's a lot of stuff in the middle, but the markets are all more and more interpreting that as pessimistic, a transition toward pessimism, you're likely to be proven that's more likely to be accurate than not.
When you say recession or a contraction, pardon me continuing with the silly questions, but the meaning of that word has been changed so many times. So could you maybe explain that to me, like M5? What do you mean by contraction or recession?
Yeah, you hear the technical definition and all sorts of stuff floating around, and there really is no definition of recession. There is no hard and fast rule that says the economy's in recession. Nor is there really an agreement about what recession means in the post-2007 era. We could have a debate about that. But generally speaking, a recession is where an economy is relatively stable and expanding. It's growing at a relatively decent rate. enough rate that causes an efficient allocation of resources, use of those resources that generally benefits most people. Not everybody, because no system is perfect. A recession is a deviation from that trend for a variety of potential reasons, but only a temporary one. So it could be that, economic growth doesn't necessarily contract. It just stops growing at the same rate. But then whatever was bothering the economy fixes itself or gets fixed. And you go back to where you would have been had there never been any recession whatsoever. And that's really the issue in the post-crisis era, because we supposedly had a great recession in 2008, except it didn't prove to be temporary. It proved to be permanent. So the whole idea of recession versus contraction, these are probably two loose terms. They're not really well defined. And what I think we mean in 2023 is potentially more like the 2008 variety than, say, the 2001 dot-com recession, where it really was a very small deviation in trend. And then after a while, we got back on trend. Whereas in 2008, we had a contraction and then we never came back, which was the worst possible case. And that's kind of what it looks like, especially after the 2020 recession, which doesn't appear to have been a recession either, more along the lines of a permanent change too. So it may be that what markets are looking at when they see all this data is they saw the 2020 recession globally as a pretty serious, severe imposition on the economy. And then 2021 made it seem like the economy was recovering and coming back, but maybe it really wasn't. Maybe that was all largely an illusion of fiscal introduction, fiscal intervention, as well as just rebounding from the lows in 2020. That eventually, after all that artificial stuff cleared out in 2022, we'd start to see the real economy reassert itself. And if the real economy is not really a recession, but sort of like what markets are thinking after 2008, where we had a sharp change in long run trend, that might account for what we see in the marketplace. So you're right to question the idea of recession, because recession itself is maybe too much of an open term.
Well, what I'm also questioning is how bad the situation really is, because what I'm seeing around me is that like everything is full. I went to a supply sort of, what do you call it, do-it-yourself shop here. Shout out to Brico, but it was full. I still stood in line like for 20 minutes, and it was during the week. Let alone like shopping malls, shopping streets, restaurants in the big cities around me, and it's all full, right? People spending money, so it doesn't seem like the people think a recession is coming. And I think that's a big part of it too, right? If people expect a recession, they might start behaving differently and spending less and stuff like that. But it doesn't, this is one person data point, right? But it doesn't seem like people are spending less around me, at least. So how do you make sense of that?
Well, there's always the issue there too, because even in the worst depressions, most of the people in society are doing fine. You go back to the Great Depression in the 1930s. That affected, maybe a quarter of the population were thrown out of work, and maybe another quarter of the population was really living day to day. But that left half of the population were probably doing better than well. Even the 2008 recession, by and large, most people survived it fine. Now, maybe they were nervous because they watched the news, they watched TV, they watched the internet, they read all these stories about financial markets and whatnot. But by and large, most people do relatively well, even during recession. What we're talking about in these downturns is all of the people who aren't doing well, or the people who are being left behind. And what really marks these contractions is the proportion of those people who aren't doing well tends to increase. And maybe you notice that, maybe you don't, because it depends on the circles they travel in, the places you go. So a contraction can happen, and if you're in a relatively well-to-do area, you might not even notice it. Whereas the people outside of that particular bracket, whatever that tier, that structure, that part of the economy, there's more people not doing well than are doing well. And that might be what really marked the 2022 transition, because even though people were spending, they're spending because prices went up, not because they're happy, they want to buy more stuff. They have to pay more to get the same amount of stuff that they got last year. And in fact, in most places, especially in Europe, they're paying more to actually get less. So they might still be spending, but they're being left further and further behind, even if it's not the same type of behavior we normally associate with recession and contraction, which is widespread unemployment. People slam their pocketbook shut. It may be the case that this recession looks and feels a bit differently.
If it looks and feels a bit different, what does that mean? Like, can we still look at history to sort of think about what asset classes will do? Like, what does real estate do? What do commodities do? Can we still compare that to what we saw in 2008?
Now, I think there's a little bit, yes and no, because it depends upon the particular scenario. What is actually driving the contraction? If it's just the reversion to the mean after 2020, then I think you get the same sort of predictions, the same sort of comparisons that can be applied there, because it turns out to be what economists call, or the internet calls, an L-shaped recovery, which is very different than something a little more of the U-shaped or of other types of, I don't want to call them recoveries, just rebounds, changes in economic activity where you stop contracting, you stop the recession. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you go back to where you were, like the old style recessions were. So I think we have to be very careful about comparing individual sets of circumstances, that we can look at a general idea of what these sorts of periods tend to look like when they happen, with the understanding that there may be some quirks and aberrations and anomalies given the particular set of circumstances and factors that we're facing today.
So it is possible, to sort of put that in simpler words, it is possible to have a commodity bull market, say, even if we have a contraction in the economy, so some type of stagflation. I don't know what you would call that. Like, is it possible?
Sure. I mean, because if you have for example, one of the biggest problems or factors in the 2021 making it look like a recovery when it really wasn't, was the restriction in supply, which is price positive for the individual good or commodity that's restricted. But for the overall economic system, that becomes a drag on it. It doesn't become inflation, it becomes the recession. So individually, that commodity could do well, or that group of commodities could do well after the recession, during the recession, depending upon the particular set of circumstances. And I think what you're thinking about is base commodities, industrial commodities that have been, oil in particular, that continue to be supply constrained. And I don't think that supply constraint is going to change anytime soon, where you could have relatively strong commodity prices, but it doesn't end up being inflationary. It ends up being repeatedly recessionary. So commodities do well in what looks like otherwise a deflationary environment.
So maybe just the way we defined recession, or you explained that to me. Can we also maybe talk about, when you say inflationary, like, is it, do you mean like on monetary level, like monetary inflation, or is it specifically goods inflation, energy inflation? How do you look at it?
Well, to me, inflation, and what really should be for everyone, is inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. What that really means is it's not the price of one set of goods or even one good that goes up. It's a general rise in aggregate prices all over the place. And it's not just a temporary rise in prices. It's a relatively permanent shift to rising prices, because there's a continuous supply of excess currency and money into the system. So you can have periods of time where consumer and producer prices go up for non-monetary reasons, but that is not inflation. That is simply the redistribution via prices of economic resources for various non-economic reasons. In this case that we're talking about, let's say oil prices are restricted in supply, which means price goes higher than it normally or it otherwise would have been given economic forces. So what happens is we end up paying higher prices for energy, oil, gasoline, whatever the case may be. So in terms of the real economy, more and more activity is directed toward the oil and energy sector, which ends up benefiting the oil and energy sector. Prices go up, profits go way up in that sector, but it doesn't benefit the economy overall. It's certainly not inflation overall, because it ends up we redistribute too much of our activity and spending to something that is long run unproductive. And because it's unproductive, because we pay more for energy, we're not getting that money back in the form of redistribution. Oil companies are not going to hire tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of new workers, which the general economy would. Therefore, we're just moving too much income activity to one specific sector. And as long as that supply constraint continues on that one specific sector, the prices and the benefits can continue to go to that direction, even at the general harm of everybody else in the economy, which leads to reductions in employment elsewhere. Because businesses that have to pay more for energy, they have a little bit less left over for workers or other forms of materials. So it becomes again, a redistribution, but a harmful redistribution on the overall economy that makes it end up acting like a recession, because the rest of the economy is being restrained from growing in the way that it could otherwise if this imposition, this redistribution, this supply shock hadn't have happened.
That makes sense, because I don't know if anybody should care, but like in my restaurant, energy bills have gone up significantly, and but my work has also picked up, and so I could use some extra help, but I'm not taking on any extra help. It's just me, my wife, my mom, and my dad, and I'm putting in extra hours myself because there's no really room for me to afford extra help. And I think it has to do with the general price level that has gone up, that I cannot translate all of that to my customers because it's simply too much. Like in some occasions, I would have to be asking just too much for a coffee or like a bacon and egg type of thing. So that makes sense.
And that's the lack of inflation, because in a genuinely inflationary scenario, what would happen? Your customers would be able to afford the higher increases because they're getting paid more at their job, or they're getting new jobs, or whatever the case may be, because the overall economy is recycling activity into the most beneficial ways. So that's really where inflation becomes inflation. The money enters the system and then it gets redistributed across enough of the economy that you need to raise your prices for higher input costs, and workers can pay those higher prices because they're getting paid more too. And it leads to this dreaded wage price spiral that economists are always and central bankers are always talking about. But the key ingredient in keeping that going and making it go is the introduction of too much money. Because if you don't have the money that goes into it, then you end up with this redistribution where one segment benefits at the expense of another. And that, left with enough time, doing that in an unproductive way leads to a reduction in potential activity. As you say, you can't hire as many workers as maybe you actually need. And eventually, maybe you have to start cutting hours. Maybe you don't have to do it, but other businesses that have workers, they have to start cutting back on hours. They have to start maybe even cutting employees to make all of these numbers work on their income statements and their business activities.
But that's not how the Fed looks at inflation, though, is it? I think Powell has mentioned that he looks at, like housing, I think housing, food, and then services X. What is it, like travel and stuff like that? Isn't like, I think he looks at it in 3 ways or something like that. And
the way they try to analyze the consumer price behavior in the economy is looking at specific sectors that may not be prone to externalities and non-economic factors. But it still is their theory of how inflation infects the economy is exactly that. They believe it's 2 different ways. It's 2 self-combining ways. One is this wage price spiral. Essentially, they believe that when an economy operates at near or at full employment or above full employment, competition for scarce workers becomes intense, which means that suddenly wage rates have to go up as businesses compete for workers. And as wage rates goes up, as we were just talking, then suddenly workers as consumers can afford to pay along higher prices that are being passed on to them by these businesses. That's the wage price spiral. And the other thing the Fed and the ECB too is really afraid of is psychology. That when consumers and businesses come to expect that prices are going to go up and continue to go up, they'll alter their behavior in a way that expectation leads to actual and genuine inflation. Now, neither of those things are actually what really happens in reality, but absent those central bankers being able to understand the monetary system, looking at the economy backwards and trying to reverse engineer an inflationary scenario or an inflationary worldview, that's the theories that they go on. And so according to the Federal Reserve, they look at the low unemployment rate in the US and say, that could be inflationary. They look at the fact that CPIs went up and stayed up longer than they expected, and they thought, that could start to inflation expectations. The combination of a tight labor market and inflation expectation potential is for the Fed the worst case scenario. But we already see consumer prices and consumer price indexes decelerating from middle of last year, which suggests that something else had already happened even before the Fed got going with rate hikes or the ECB in Europe. As you've seen, European CPIs are coming down too. That doesn't mean that consumer prices are gone or the pressures are gone, but it seems like there's a material reduction in them.
In the rate of change.
Rate of change. I mean, they're still prices are still going up for the most part, but they're not going up nearly as fast as they were.
Isn't the Fed? I mean, if you look at the people who work at the Fed, you think they can lift the world with their brain power? Aren't they supposed to know all of that and act accordingly? Like, I don't know, maybe stop QT, go back to QE, start cutting in. Isn't that? I mean, aren't they supposed to do that?
You would think. You're exactly right. That's the impression that they leave the public, which is intentional. The idea is to manipulate expectations and emotions. And if you believe the Fed has all this about this knowledge, this power, these massive tools, then they can actually have a more realistic, plausible chance of getting you to do what they need you to do. Because otherwise, you're right. You would think that they would look at the system and say, we need to do X, Y, and Z at this time, and then this time, and this time, and just plan it all out ahead with a level of accuracy and precision. But instead, what do? They say, well, maybe we're going to hike rates. Maybe we're not going to hike rates. Maybe the economy is okay. Maybe it's not. There's a level of uncertainty here. Risks are tilted and balanced. And they use all of this really soft, weaselly language because they can never say for certain what's actually going on. And that's really the issue here, is because they should be able to say that. They should be able to say the monetary system is doing X. We need to do Y, and eventually that will lead to Z in the real economy. But they can't. They have none of this precision because they're all just making it up as they go. They're just looking at the data in the same way you and I are. That's really how sad this is. They're looking at the same things that you and I are and trying to make the same sort of judgments because they don't really have a good sense of what's actually happening. They have some of these half-baked backwards theories that really they don't have any alternatives for.
Could it maybe be that they're like planning something super innovative? I don't know, like Governor Waller has suggested that the reverse repo balances would be, that they could become interchangeable with bank reserves, and because of that, they can. I guess what it resulted in is that the Fed may be able to pull off something like being hawkish while being dovish type of policy, where like QT continues for another few years while also cutting interest rates, so tightening the financial economy but loosening the real economy. Like it could be that they're trying to engineer the soft landing in that way or something.
That's what they would like you to believe, wouldn't it? I mean, they would love for everybody to believe that they could pull off something like that with nothing more than these ridiculously absurd tools. The reverse repo and bank reserves are interchangeable. They have been from the very beginning. It means absolutely nothing to the real economy because there's absolutely no correlation to the level of bank reserves, whether locked up supposedly by IOER or IOR, as they call it nowadays, or the reverse repo. The Fed has all of these tools to manipulate the level of bank reserves when the level of bank reserves is immaterial to any meaningful action in the real economy. We've known that from Japan from the very beginning. So if Governor Waller is talking about being dovish while hawkish, that's just nonsense. And of course it's nonsense. The idea that the Fed wants to perpetuate is the fact that they can engineer a soft landing because they believe if you believe the Fed will engineer a soft landing, you'll act accordingly, and then it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. How does the reverse repo and the level of bank reserve actually lead to a soft landing? Nobody ever tries to put these dots together and connect these things because there is no way. Banks, they're not. The idea is supposedly that bank reserves influence bank behavior. Bank behavior influenced by bank reserves then either becomes supplying more credit or supplying less credit as needed. But that gets back to the original question you just had, Antonio, which is, well, if that's how it really works, then why doesn't the Fed say, we're restricting X level of bank reserves. This will create an X percent reduction on bank credit, which will reduce the economy by Y. They don't do that. They just leave it open to interpretation because there really is no relationship one to the other. And there hasn't been for decades. It gets back to the whole Volcker problem, which was bank reserves, the level of bank reserves don't correlate to any type of bank behavior, certainly not to any of the economic activities and aggregates that we see out there either. But again, if they really believe that if they get you to believe in the soft landing, that's a plausible and that we can do it, they think that you'll act as if there's going to be a soft landing, and then that will create the soft landing. And of course, that's why it never really works.
So it's almost like a Ponzi scheme on a huge level, if you believe.
Yeah. It's really a fairy tale that supposedly comes real. And it's, again, you don't have to take my word for it. Haruhiko Kuroda, the Bank of Japan's long-standing governor, actually admitted as much. And was it 2016 or 2017? He said he compared it to Peter Pan. If you believe you can fly, then you can fly. These words came out of his mouth because that's what these people actually do. That's what they believe. If they can get you to believe that you can fly, then you'll fly in the economy and the economy will be fine. That's really how ridiculous and absurd it is. And of course, that goes a long way to explaining why we're in this mess to begin with, because fairy tales don't actually help in the real world.
But would that work with I guess what they're trying to achieve by tightening the financial economy, loosening the real economy is steepening the yield curve, right? So
which obviously the opposite is happening.
right. So what could they do to steepen the yield curve, or what needs to happen?
What would need to happen is, as Ben Bernanke said in 2002, to be able to credibly promise to be irresponsible with the printing press. Paul Krugman said the same thing about Japan way back in the 1990s. Rather than use the printing press, these central bankers believe they need to credibly promise to be irresponsible to raise inflation expectations. And if inflation expectations go up, then either nominal real yields will have to go down, or nominal yields will have to adjust higher to reflect expectations of higher inflation and growth down the road. But what the market is saying is, we know the Fed isn't credible. We know the ECB isn't credible. Therefore, we're going to pile into all the deflationary hedges that we can possibly find. We're going to go long in bonds. We're going to go long in duration. Even in Germany, the inversion in the German curve is absolutely unprecedented because the marketplace is saying, the Fed thinks there's a soft landing. The ECB thinks there's a soft landing. None of that is credible. This bank reserve stuff, the reverse repo, the ECB with its negative or its deposit floor, all of these things, it's just accounting smoke and mirrors. In reality, the market is positioned. That's why the yield curves are so steeply inverted, because the market is positioned for lower growth and lower inflation expectations down the road.
Right. That's also where the market and the Fed, by the way, don't agree on what the terminal rate would be. What is it? The market believes now that it's 4.75, and the Fed says it's 5.25. So it needs a couple more.
I would just caution, don't take these markets literally. The market is not saying that the terminal rate is 475. That's just balance of probabilities. When you look at probability spectrums, it could be somewhere around that range. And the other part of that too is, as these curves invert, the market is not saying we expect the Fed to cut the rates by 2 percentage points. The market is saying that there's a high probability that rates will be lower at some point in the future than they are today. And the probability is so high that these curves are so inverted that we almost never have seen this type of behavior before. So the markets are saying there's probably still some higher rates to go ahead of us. And then at some point, whether it's the second half of this year, next year, whatever the case may be, it's almost near certain that rates are going lower, even though Jay Powell just last week said we have no plans to cut rates. The ECB, Christine Lagarde, I forget who else it was from the governing council, said we have absolutely no plans to cut rates. We're still going to hike a little more, and then we're going to keep rates up for longer. And the markets are all saying, yeah, you believe that, but we're betting against that scenario. We're betting against that outlook.
And then you don't believe them as well, I'm guessing.
I would rather believe the markets than these Federal Reserve or ECB officials with their econometric models that are utterly worthless. I mean, How many times do we have to go through this same scenario? We just did this a couple of years ago.
Mm.
The Fed said in 2018 the same thing. The employment market is tight. Look at the low unemployment rate. That's going to generate inflation. We need to raise rates. And the market said, what the hell are you talking about? The economy is falling off. This is pre-COVID, remember. This is 2018, 2019. Inversion started in the middle of 2018 while the Fed was becoming even more hawkish. And then what happened? The Fed stopped hiking rates and then ended up cutting them, just as the market said it would, because the market leads the Fed, not the other way around. We saw this in 2006 and 2007. The Fed was raising rates from 2004, 5, and 6 for the same reasons. They judged a relatively tight labor market would lead to aggressive inflation. Greenspan, then Bernanke, hiked the federal funds rate. And the market said, we're more worried about this housing bubble thing that could possibly burst and what that would do to long-run potential growth and expectations. So the Fed raised short-term interest rates, long-term interest rates barely moved. Next thing you know, we've got a flat yield curve, then it inverted. Guess which one was right? The markets were right to be worried about the house, not just the housing bubble, but the long-run implications to global growth potential in that aftermath. So I'm gonna go with the marketplace rather than the econometric models that have absolutely no place in them for market prices and behavior.
Okay, but if that's true, isn't it also true that given the expectation for the rates to come down, meaning that the expectation for further rate hikes are now lower, we then see more risk come into the market. We experienced the Fed meeting as dovish. Basically, we see still high but lower mortgage rates, and so therefore aren't the market's expectations also having an effect on the real economy by influencing the long-term rates? Am I making any sense?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, because that's what we're told to believe, that lower long-term rates are a good thing, that they're effective stimulus. They're consistent with, as you said, loosening financial conditions when they're not. Lower rates and inverted curves, those types of things, especially lower rates relative to short rates, that's indicative of tight financial conditions. So in the sense that, yes, lower mortgage rates might be more stimulative to maybe buyers who maybe can afford more houses, but it may not be stimulative to mortgage lenders who are thinking, I need to be less risky here. I need to be more risk averse because look what's happening in the risk-free rate. A lower risk-free rate is never a good sign. Because think about it. Whenever you see the Fed or any major central bank cut rates, what is usually going on at that time? Usually financial chaos and market recession, or not a macro recession. So when the markets are hedged for rates to go down, that includes central bank policy rates to go down, but as a reaction to what markets are today already prepared for. So markets are looking ahead at something that will cause the Fed to lower rates. That's not the same as loosening financial conditions. That's getting the timing and sequence correct rather than being always behind and looking backwards.
Is that what happened in the 70s, where you had supply chain issues and then the Fed ended up cutting rates like maybe too early, and they had inflation coming back in full force, and then pretty much nobody was happy in the economy?
Well, the Fed had no idea what was going on in the 70s, so they were doing the same thing. They were responding to conditions. Arthur Burns, the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time, even told Congress in 1971 or 72, they expected the 69-70 recession to end the Great Inflation because it was already several years old by then. They expected that when the economy fell off into recession, that amount of slack in the labor market would reduce inflationary potentials. But what he said was, it looks like the rule of economics had been thrown out because here we are on the other side of the recession and prices have come right back up. That wasn't because of the Fed. It was because the commercial monetary system, commercial banking system, was creating more money that was outside of what the Fed actually looked at. The Fed's narrow aggregates didn't capture the amount of monetary growth that was going on outside of them, not just M2, but also outside of the United States in this Eurodollar system. So we had this massive monetary explosion that was causing consumer price behavior in the real economy. But because the Fed's focus and its view was so narrow, it couldn't see the monetary explosion that was creating the problems, both recessionary and inflationary. And so it would respond to actual activities or actual outcomes and things that were happening in the real economy rather than the bigger problem, which was the monetary expansion. So the Fed is always looking backward at what happened rather than looking ahead based on what would be useful in terms of understanding the monetary economics there.
I remember last time we spoke, you told me that you don't really care about M2 money supply
Nope.
as it wasn't representative of the money pool that is out there. But still, if you look at that chart, there seems to have been, I mean, a relatively big drop in there, in terms of, I guess, size, absolute size, not relative size, maybe. But I mean, there's a drop in there, and I don't quite understand where it comes from and if it even results in anything and how it ties into this whole discussion.
Are you talking about the current M2 reduction since late last year?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I guess.
A lot of this is just a reversal of what happened in 2020 and 2021, related to what the federal government and Federal Reserve are doing, the quantitative tightening. Without getting down that too far into that, I think this is too much of a distraction. But in the mechanics of quantitative easing, the mechanics of the Federal Reserve's, the federal government's intervention, commercial banks created checkable deposits that they then used to purchase treasuries at auctions. Some of those treasuries they held on to, some of those treasuries they sold to the general public. Either way, the creation of treasuries after the CARES Act led to an increase in checkable deposits. Some of those ended up at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve bought a lot through quantitative easing. Now, as we go through quantitative tightening, in a sense, the situation reverses. Those that were bought by the Federal Reserve under quantitative easing now went into quantitative tightening. As those treasuries mature and expire and roll off the Fed's balance sheet, it reduces the level of checkable deposits at the commercial banking system, which reduces M2.
How does that influence the real economy? And I guess there's a lag, like nothing at all.
No, well, the only influence would be the absence of any further expansion of federal government activities, because that's what was being financed at the time. Banks were creating checkable deposits to allow the government to then deposit those funds into citizens' accounts. Now we just have the absence of that activity. So the banks are not financing the federal government because the federal government isn't doing what it used to be doing. So in one sense, it could be a drag on the relative to the real economy, but you're assuming that the real economy, that's the only variable in the real economy. What was supposed to have happened is that level of spending that was created by depositing money in Americans' accounts would lead to the virtuous circle where American spending would lead to companies hiring more workers and investing more, and you have this economic cycle being restarted. So as the government reduces its footprint on the real economy, rescales reduces its activities, the economy continues to take off anyway. So in reality, it's not supposed to have any effect on the economy because all it was supposed to be doing, as John Maynard Keynes said a long time ago, is priming the pump. So the mechanical unwinding of that previous intervention really shouldn't have any impact on the real economy.
So it's not like, because QT is tightening of the financial economy. That's something that I feel like I've sort of remembered from somewhere. So I feel like it should be true. But if it is tightening of the...
not.
So, okay.
It's one of those things. The level of bank reserves can go up, the level of bank reserves can go down, and it makes no difference whatsoever. Not here, not Japan, not anywhere. That's the thing. It sounds like the level of bank reserve should be meaningful to something somewhere because it's bankers, it's base. They even call it base money. But what if it's not? What if all of this is just accounting? What if this is just moving stuff around? Because you can't use a bank reserve. You or I can't use bank reserves. We were dependent upon the bank to do something in response to being given bank reserves. That's really what this comes down to. What the Fed hopes happens is that when the Fed buys a treasury bond or a mortgage bond from a commercial bank, that will make the commercial bank do something in response to that transaction. But if the commercial bank doesn't do anything in response to that transaction, it was all just accounting. It was all just trivia. It's all just numbers on a piece of paper. And study after study, you can just look at the real economic variables. You see there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever between the level of bank reserves and what banks do. because banks are the ultimate monetary deciders here, not the Federal Reserve. The Fed is just hoping to influence bank behavior when history shows that it can't, because the level of bank reserves is immaterial to the factors that are affecting commercial bank behavior, which are more about liquidity risk, a general sense of risk aversion, and a number of restrictive balance sheet factors. The level of bank reserves doesn't even come onto the list.
So there's no real chance for the Fed to engineer a soft landing.
The only chance the Fed really has is not through the banking channel, it's through psychology, as we said before. Mm-hmm. If you can get enough people in the real economy, enough employers to believe in the soft landing, then they'll think, well, even though things are going bad now, they should be relatively better in the future. Maybe I'll start hiring a few people, even though my own business isn't really looking all that great. I'm going to start hiring people today, anticipating this soft landing, because I really believe in Jay Powell. I really like what Christine Lagarde has to say. I think they've got this stuff covered. So my business isn't great today, but I think it will be next week, or not next week, maybe next year, next month, whatever the case may be. So maybe today I'm going to hire another employee. Or the workers are thinking, well, this soft landing stuff, that's credible. I might get a raise next week or next month or next year or something. Like I might get another job. So I'm going to spend a little bit more today than I would have otherwise, because I feel a little bit better about this economic uncertainty. I think Jay Powell's got it covered. I think the ECB's on the right track. And so they're trying to engineer this Peter Pan soft landing from getting people to believe in it. Therefore, they'll act as if that's the case. They're not influencing bank behavior, because banks are doing the opposite. So it's really about psychology and emotion, which gets back to what your original observation was, Antonio. Why don't we hear central bankers talk in the language of science and precision? Why do we hear them talking about in the language of emotion? Because that's what this is really about.
It's a shame Bernie Madoff's dead, by the way. I'm watching this documentary on Netflix that he lost a lot of money. And then he sort of made people believe, because he took a loan and then paid back his investors and all that stuff. So he made people believe that he was this genius who didn't lose all that money when everybody else lost it. Maybe the Fed could consult with him if he was still alive.
Yeah, I think they want a real expert in Peter Pan theory. Then they should. They should have consulted with me. Didn't he pass away a few years ago?
Yeah, he did.
I think they missed their chance there.
No, it's unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, sure.
But just one. I mean, this is a fact that the Federal Reserve and all central banks have been really struggling with for decades. It's just that we've never talked about it, because we believed for a long time that they knew what they were talking about. Because of that so-called Great Moderation, that period after the end of the Great Inflation, the 1980s, 1990s, and the first half of the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, it sounded like maybe they did figure something out, right? Because look at this. We went through this absolutely epic period of massive economic growth all over the world, and there was barely any recessions. We had some financial volatility, but even the dot-com bust didn't lead to something like the Great Depression as it did in 1929. Maybe these guys figured out what they were supposed to be doing. That's what gave them the idea that they could use this credibility garbage to influence behavior. Because if you believe the Fed created the Great Moderation, then you might believe the Fed can get you out of massive trouble, like in 2008. But here's the thing. 2008 happened. They didn't get us out of trouble. Everything the Fed did nothing to stop the crisis. The crisis just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the Fed did more and more and more in response to events that already happened. Events, by the way, that the markets told you were going to happen before they actually did, which gets us back to the sequencing. Markets understand the monetary system. They understand the macro fundamentals ahead of time and can tell you what not only is going to happen in the economy, but also what the Federal Reserve is going to do in response to what happens in the economy, as well as how effective that response will be in the real economy, which, spoiler alert, is not expected to be very effective whatsoever. So everything that we look around today says markets are prepared for some pretty bad scenarios. Why? It's not because Jay Powell engineered a soft landing.
Well, you yourself have been preparing, and I guess also you've had quite negative expectations for a while now. You've not trusted them to do all this. What would it take for you to turn positive in the economy and get bullish on equities, for example?
Well, I would have to see it in the markets because I'm not smart enough to figure all this stuff out. I just look at the marketplace, and I mean that's what's beautiful about these massive, huge markets is that they're really information machines. They're discounting mechanisms. The stock market isn't, because there's no fundamental factor driving stock market prices, where there is in bonds and fixed income, because you have default potentials, you have real liquidity issues. So all of these things combined, and you can look at these yield curves that give you all this tremendous amount of information about what the system is considering. What are the factors driving the biggest players with the most money at risk? What are they worried about? And so they tell you all of this thing. If the market system said, we're starting to get the sense that there is a soft landing, that we actually have, that maybe central bankers have actually done it, you would see it in the curves. The curves would begin to uninvert and then steepen out again. So you would see long-term rates rising relative to short-term rates. Not just long-term rates rising, because long-term rates rose all through last year, but they rose so much less than short-term rates that that was the signal to say that there was so much skepticism in the marketplace about this idea that we're going into a soft landing. So if that completely changed, we would see it across all of these markets. But here's the thing. I know I say that all the time. Here's the thing. Here's another thing. The other thing is, it's not just one inversion or another. These things have proliferated all over the place. All the markets are saying, we're really worried. We're hedged for some bad scenarios. And they're all doing it in a way that we probably, in some places, we've never seen this happen before. So if some of those start to change and those start to go away, then I would say something significant has actually changed in the real economy. I don't think it would be monetary policy from Federal Reserve or ECB. It would be something else. I don't know what that would be. What could possibly provoke an actual genuine recovery? Who knows what that could be, but we would see it in the markets before it actually happened.
What is it? Because you say the markets will be telling you this. What does it tell you that last year bonds fell more than equities, and it was like the first time on record since I don't know how many years, but it was like a phenomenon? What does that tell you?
It just tells me that there is some influence from central bankers. The only reason bond prices fell is because of central bankers are offering higher alternative money rates at the short end. If you're intending on buying a 5-year U.S. Treasury and the Fed's going to offer a much higher reverse repo rate that then influences the actual repo rate, you might sell your U.S. Treasury, even though you believe that the growth and inflation expectations are going down. You can sell the 5-year U.S. Treasury and get a better rate in the forward part of the curve. So the fact that bonds had a terrible year last year is a reflection of Jay Powell, not economic fundamentals, which is why the curves inverted so much, because the fundamentals said, you're wrong, Jay Powell. And so there was more demand left over in even longer term rates than there otherwise would have been if Jay Powell was right, because long-term rates would have gone up more than short-term rates did. I think that's really the way to think about it. As terrible a year as bonds had, they should have had a much worse year last year, and they didn't.
Okay. I know you almost have to run here in a couple of minutes, so I want to read some of the notes that I made here, and you add what you think should be added, or correct me where you think I was wrong. First point that you made was that you think we're in a transition phase between basically good and bad times, and you expect a contraction to come, one that is more like the 2008 and not the dot-com bubble.
I would be careful about saying that. I'm saying that I don't think things never repeat. So I wouldn't say that we're looking at potentially repeating 2008. I'm just saying that the level of concern in the market is of that type of potential. That it's similar. It's really serious possible scenarios, rather than in 2001 where we had just basically a minor hiccup.
Okay, that makes sense. Asset classes that might do well would basically be the asset classes that have supply chain issues. So it would not be something that central bankers can influence. But if we talk about commodities like oil, I'm also thinking copper long term, where there's not enough support for production to come online and stuff like that. That's what you would expect to do well in the coming environment. Is that right?
Yeah, and we've already seen that with oil. Oil, given the level of demand potential in the economy, oil should probably be much lower than it actually is, but yet it's hanging in the 70s in the US. Copper's up back over $4 a pound, which is despite the fact that, we're general recession scenarios. And then Peru, of course, supply again. So it's supply stories.
Okay. And then arguably the biggest takeaway here for me was the Peter Pan thing, where the stuff that, like,
look that up. I'm not making this up. It sounds as ridiculous. It sounds absurd, but I am not making this up. Hirohiko Kuroda, the head of the Bank of Japan, spilled the beans. He talked about how it's all Peter Pan policy. If I can make you believe you can fly, then the economy will fly.
Right. So when people like Governor Waller are communicating that reverse repo and bank reserves, oftentimes very complicated things that to us seem like, okay, this is very smart, this is going to work. The only thing that they're trying to do is make us believe that it's going to work, because if we believe that it's going to work, then a soft landing, the only way really a soft landing could work is if we believe that it's going to work. I think that was sort of the biggest takeaway.
Yes, the old fallacy of correlation. We take something that's trivial, but yet you have this trivial thing that happens, and then something good happens, and outside of it, we correlate the two. We think the Fed engineered something particularly good when it had nothing to do with the Fed. Because what the Fed is talking, what Governor Wallace, that's just all trivial nonsense.
Right. Let's assume all this is right, by the way. Who do you think is going to suffer the most? Like, what part of the population, what part of the economy is going to feel this the most? And maybe more specifically, how do I not be that part of the population? How do I not suffer from this?
Well, as usual, the people who suffer are workers, and it's usually the lower skilled workers. We've already seen that. After 2008, in the United States, participation rate dropped, and it never came back. And then guess what happened? After 2020, the participation dropped and still hasn't come back because businesses, they continue to cut, focus too much on their costs. And there's a structural unemployment problem in Europe, especially after 2022. I know there's lots of talk and chatter about hidden unemployment there as well. So this is the same deflationary consequences that we see all the time happen through history. That it's those who suffer the worst are marginal workers. Those who have the lowest value and lowest skills available in the marketplace, they're the easiest ones for businesses to get rid of.
Right. So if you had a psychology degree, you better learn how to do electricity or something else.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Jeff, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for putting this much time in me. If people want to know more from you, it's Eurodollar University on YouTube. What else?
Yeah, it's also the website too, eurodollar.university, social media, all that stuff. You search for Eurodollar University, you'll find me somewhere.
Okay. Thanks a lot for investing your time with me, Jeff.
My pleasure, Antonio. It's always good to see you.